Hi, it's Henry Shelford here, Chairperson and Trustees of SarcoidosisUK, and here we're doing another vaccine video, and we're doing it with Dr. Robina Coker, who, as many of you know, I'm sure know, so we've done a lot of videos with her, and she's just fantastic and a fantastic human being. Welcome, Robina.
Thank you very much, Henry. It's very good to see you.
It's wonderful to see you. Now, I've skipped the normal intro because I think you and I were talking and realised that this has been over a year now since our first one. Our first was on February the 14th when we were just starting to talk about COVID. And if you think about that date, it was well ahead of really most organisations realising that we're about to hit something very serious. And Robina had identified it and very kindly got involved to sort of communicate and tell people about COVID, and has done it again and again and again. And there are some years where you go, gosh, that whisked by. Not this one. Not this one. This one. We've all felt. I think we can. Anyway, so I thought what would be quite fun is we're going to skip back to the past, and rather than do the intro and tell you all the amazing things about Robina, I'm going to let the Robina and me of old tell you about all the great things about Robina. And we're going to play you a clip from February the 14th, 2020, our first video. I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled, actually. Thank you so much for doing this. It's really important. So Robina is a consultant in respiratory medicine with a specialism in sarcoidosis at this, which is Imperial College's Hammersmith Hospital. She is a doctor 2 times over, so she's a medical doctor and a PhD doctor. And the PhD was investigating the molecular mechanisms underlying the development of lung fibrosis. So it's very important in sarcoidosis and other interstitial lung diseases. And she did that at the National Heart and Lung Institute in UCL. She's also clinical director at the National Institute of Health Research in this region. She has a budget of 14 million for into research, and she's published papers specifically on travelling with a lung disease. So we honestly couldn't have a more ideal person to ask these questions, and we're very grateful. So thank you. Now, before we go into the questions, and if you have questions, please post them as comments on the video, and we will be going to them. So before we go to the questions, and we've had some sent in, which we're going to start off with, I'm going to do a quick overview of the statistics of COVID-19. So as of right now, there are 64,447 confirmed cases. And the World Health Organization has designated it a global emergency, but one that can be contained. The vast majority are in mainland China. There are only in sort of inverted commas 218 cases outside it. There have been 1,384 deaths, with 2 outside China, 1 in the Philippines and 1 in Japan, and 7,007 people have confirmed as recovered. The NHS UK has tested 2,521 people, of which 9 have been positive and either have recovered or are in quarantine. That was an amazing. I remember that day, and it does seem a long time ago. And Peter on Facebook has just said that clip. It seems like it was a decade ago.
Yes.
This has been a long year. I mean, do you it ends up saying that the UK, the NHS has tested 2,521 people, and that there have been nine cases. What do you remember about that moment and how you felt compared to how it's turned out?
I was fairly anxious about it right from the start, I have to say, because it became very clear very quickly that with the level of international travel that we now have, this was going to spread very quickly. And I think we were very fortunate with SARS and MERS that we didn't really experience anything significant in the West. But I was concerned that I thought this had the potential to spread very rapidly. And I was concerned that even when we were doing community testing early on, we were probably not picking up anything like the number of active cases. So I was concerned. I don't think we could have foreseen what happened. I remember someone in the cabinet saying that if we had only 20,000 deaths, that would be a good outcome. And that sounded an awful lot, but clearly we were being prepared for more. But I don't think we could ever have seen or anticipated that we would have 120,000 deaths. And it's just a terrible figure. And as you say, it's just been a very long year with so much happening. It sometimes feels as though time stands still, and every few days the situation changes, the advice changes, guidance changes, and what was true a week ago or 2 weeks ago is no longer the case. And that makes it quite difficult. It's quite tiring as well, because you're continually adjusting to new news. So I think it's been a momentous year. It's obviously been a defining year, and one that will go down in history as very significant.
Yeah, no, without question, it has been something else. I think we can all agree with that, and I think it's a testament to you that, and thank you for getting involved. That you did identify this issue and the potentiality of it very early on. It allowed us to talk to people at SarcoidosisUK and with sarcoidosis to know as much as they possibly could as it all unfolded. And I think that's been incredibly important. We've certainly seen it. So anyway, thank you. And now onto the work. Enough reminiscing of the old times when we could stand close together.
Yes, indeed, without a mask.
Without a mask, but it's been. I can't quite remember. I can't remember if I've seen you since then. There was maybe one more or not. But certainly haven't seen you for a year. But we talk through this. We've had a lot of questions sent in, and as we were talking about, this is an incredibly important moment. We're at the vaccine moment. You could hear us just now. We're so hopeful this is the end. I think that we're almost, starting to reminisce about what that was like. I think reminisce is possibly the wrong word. I need to expand my vocabulary. But we've had a lot of questions in, and this is a critical moment because it's people. Almost everyone with sarcoidosis will have been offered a vaccine at this point, and the people watching, there's a good chance they've maybe not taken it yet, and so this is particularly aimed at those people. So on to the questions. We've split them up into 4 people. So we've got vaccines general, vaccines and medication, vaccine efficacy, vaccine and side effects. This video is about vaccines. If you've not haven't worked that out yet, it is. Nadia sent in a couple. If we manage to get both doses, how long can we expect immunity to last? Or do we expect it to be annual, like the flu jab, or more or less often than that?
Thank you, Nadia. It's a very good question. And I don't think we know the full answer to that at the moment. So one of the reasons that we have booster flu vaccinations every year is that the influenza virus mutates very rapidly. And it mutates to escape the vaccine. So every year the vaccine is modified to be more effective against the new strains of the flu virus. And obviously there are, as you've seen in the news, there are variants of interest and variants of concerns, they're called. So these are new mutations of the coronavirus. It seems very unlikely that the current vaccines will not be effective against those variants because the virus would have to mutate very considerably to escape the vaccine completely. However, it may be that some of the vaccines are not as effective against the new mutations as they were against the original coronavirus. And that's why the idea has been put forward that we may need a booster in the autumn, and we may need an annual vaccine, but we just don't know at the moment exactly how long the immunity will last.
Thank you. I think that's important about the variants and how with flu we're getting a lot more. And I think that there's a new one every year, and maybe that's what we're looking at. And in terms of how likely it is, I think it's, Robina can correct me if I'm wrong. She totally will. I mean, it's been slammed down. It's most likely, if it is, it's unlikely to be more than once a year. And that's partly because of the cycle of the virus. So we know that it's going to spike into winter, so in the same way flu does. So we'd expect to see a vaccine being pushed out annually in autumn if it was going to be on that kind of schedule. And so for that kind of reason, it's less likely for us to expect it to be more than once a year. But certainly I think most money is on initially starting with once a year, isn't it? And if you want to look in your crystal ball, you could also just look at what the vaccines that have been purchased by the government, which run us till 2022, with good amounts, which suggests that that's really the line of thinking that they're on at the moment. But with new data, as Robina was talking about, with new data, things change. So we don't know exactly, but that's I think where we're most likely looking at now. Nadia got in fast, and she actually put in 2 questions. So her second was, how many people with sarcoid have had the vaccine so far?
Yeah, well, I don't think we know that, Nadia. I mean, I certainly don't have access to those data. And I've not seen anything published. I mean, the primary care teams will know, but of course, sarcoidosis is an orphan disease, so one general practitioner or one group of practices will not have very many people in their practice with sarcoidosis. So I think we just have to wait and see on that. The answer.
I think that is exactly. We don't know the exact percentage. I think the thing we do know is we do know that quite a lot of people with sarcoidosis have had the jab, and we know that for absolute certain. And we've, in particular, been doing. Hopefully, a lot of people caught the live stream with the Royal Brompton just recently, and they've been very active talking to their cohort about their vaccines. And I know a very large number of their patients have. We know anecdotally from a lot of correspondence with us that there are a lot of people who've had it. We're doing currently a wider COVID survey. Within it, we're asking people about the vaccine, and I can tell you there's a lot of people with successfully been vaccinated. So although we don't know that exact data point, and Robina is a fantastic research-focused person, so if you ask her a technical question, you will get a technical answer, and it'll be solid. But so although we don't know that percentage, we do know a lot of people have taken it successfully. I think that might go to the crux of Nadia's question.
No, you're right, Henry, and I've certainly got a number of my patients who've had it, and
and they haven't all just fallen over dead, right? I think this is the critical thing.
No, they sound surprised when I ask them and say, "Oh yes, of course, I had that weeks ago."
Perfect, exactly. Rachel, I had my first jab in January. I'm jealous of you, Rachel. And I'm due to have my second jab in April. And then on the first flight out of here, shielding will have ended by then. Is there an advised waiting time for returning to work after you've had your second jab?
That's an interesting question, isn't it, Rachel? So I've not seen anything, and we may get further advice nearer the time. But reading, the data, it looks as though you will have very good protection after your second dose, and that will kick in almost immediately. So I would at the moment, on the data that we have, not see any reason why you shouldn't go back to work immediately after your second dose, providing you feel well and you don't have any side effects. I mean, the main side effects, and we can come on to these later, are a little bit of a sore arm, and and a few people, feel a little bit fluey. So they may have a fever, they may have some chills, they may feel a bit achy. And this is because the vaccination is really like a training program for your immune system. And it's trying to trick your body into thinking that you have the infection without you actually contracting the infection at all. So you may get a few symptoms afterwards. So depending on that and depending on your job, you might want to delay it a few days. But in general, just as when you have the flu vaccine, there shouldn't be any reason why you shouldn't go back to work straight afterwards.
Thank you. Actually, let's do you talked about the side effects and those general questions. What would you say to people who are in the vaccine hesitancy group who have been offered one but not yet done it?
Yeah, well, I understand if you're not someone who normally has the annual flu vaccine. There's been a lot of hype about these vaccines. I can understand people feeling slightly apprehensive and cautious, but really there is absolutely nothing to be worried about. The common side effect, which seems to be true whether you have the Pfizer or the Oxford vaccine, is a slightly more sore injection site in your arm than we see with the flu vaccine. That seems to be fairly consistent. So you may, at the most for a couple of days, notice a little bit of tenderness and achiness around that injection site. That wears off very quickly, but that's quite common. And it's much less common to develop the other symptoms I talked about. So feeling a bit feverish, having some chills, muscle aches. Those things are much less common. But again, they're short-lived and they really resolve usually within 24 hours. So I don't think there should be anything to worry about, actually. And the risks of getting coronavirus are so much greater. The risks of having the virus, it's been shown to be incredibly safe. We've now got live data on hundreds of, tens and hundreds of thousands of people worldwide who've had this vaccine, and very rare allergic responses and no serious side effects. So I think we can be confident these vaccines are safe and they're effective and well tolerated. So I'd say be brave and go for it.
Absolutely, and I think that's the critical point you've hit on. Is like, you've got some choices here. The choices are that you potentially go out in the wild and get the disease in the wild, untamed, aggressive, and potentially fatal, or you can have it as a vaccine, and the vast majority of people are going to get a slightly achy arm.
That's right.
And so it's which, even if you do perceive, and I think the data, as Robina has said very clearly, is that it is safe. Even if you do perceive some, have some concern about it, that has to be wildly different to getting it in the wild. Like, so either way, the vaccine's the way forward.
Yes, a non-medical friend of mine said to me, well, it's an absolute no-brainer. The risks of the vaccine are infinitesimally small compared with the risks of getting the actual infection.
Yeah, and that's the core. And in terms of, interacting with a bug, this is what we do all the time. Our bodies get hit by a pathogen, by a bacteria, a virus. They react. They create a antibody. I worry I've got that wrong. I'm not sure about bacteria. Virus definitely, and that's what your body does, and that's what it's doing with the vaccine. And in terms of are we doing something crazily abnormal to our body? We just aren't. This is what our body does frequently. And in terms of people with sarcoidosis, our bodies are doing it, and so it's not different from our day to day.
No, and I think it's worth remembering as well, there's been so much hype about this because we've all been in this living through this extraordinary times with extraordinary connectedness in terms of news and fake news and so on. So we've all become experts, if you like, on this. We're suddenly very aware of topics that we probably didn't pay much attention to in the past. But if you think about it historically, polio and smallpox absolutely ravaged societies before vaccination, and vaccination was absolutely key to pretty much eradicating them and preventing millions of infections worldwide, and making the countries free of those infections, which were really deadly. So we've got a lot of collective history and track record on vaccinations. Vaccinations are not new, and they really do work, and they are a lifeline in terms of preventing the sort of devastation that these viruses can cause.
Thank you. And I was looking, you mentioned the pox, so I was looking up quickly because I want to make sure I got it right, because the invention of the pox vaccine, they used to take a related disease, the cowpox, and just rub it on you. And so these were the sores off a cow would then get rubbed on you, and it was close enough that your body learnt how to protect you from smallpox. And that's the start. So historically, we would take the sores of an animal and rub it on your skin. Things have improved, people. These are much, much better options. Rachel, whose question we just asked, said, thank you for answering. I indeed had a sore dead arm and felt extremely tired for a couple of days afterwards. I had the Pfizer jab, and I will be returning to work all well after a week after my second jab. We need to, said she's having her second dose from Pfizer next week. She's been told to expect symptoms, but she had none in the first day other than a slightly achy arm. Stuart had his first Oxford vaccine and is waiting for his second in April. All of these people are people watching. I'm assuming have sarcoidosis. So, like if you're in the hesitancy bunch, I imagine you could actually message them and ask them how it went, as well as hearing from us. So, we are a community trying to help. We've had someone, Caroline on Facebook, has messaged saying, I'm concerned about side effects. I've heard of several sarcoid patients having long-term months of symptoms, which are very much like a sarc flare-up. It makes me feel very cautious.
Okay. So, I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? So months of symptoms, I wondered when they were offered the vaccine, because really not many people were being offered it before early January, so that's 8 weeks ago. I assume those people, if they do have a flare of what they think is their sarcoid symptoms, have been to consult their own sarcoid specialist or their general practitioner about that. Of course, the other problem is that sarcoid symptoms can be so non-specific, it can be very difficult to determine what is a flare and what isn't. So I think, in the very few people for whom that's true, it's really important to talk to your GP and talk to your sarcoidosis specialist so they can do some tests to find out what's actually happening. And what I'm certainly seeing is people with sarcoid who have had COVID and now have really prolonged symptoms, and the likelihood is that these are symptoms of long COVID, because they're quite tricky to disentangle from flares of sarcoidosis. And in order to do that, you do need to have a chat with your sarcoidosis specialist and think about some tests, which will help to distinguish the two.
And actually on long COVID, I'm definitely in the camp of where I think, because I think I had coronavirus very early on, and then I was ill for some time, and ill enough that I had an MRI, I had a heart investigation, I had a number of other things. I was really struggling, and that goes to actually Nikki's point on Facebook. She said, I had the AstraZeneca vaccine around 3 weeks ago, first dose, and I believe I had quite a reaction to it. terrible migraine, my arm swelled, I had pain in my neck and shoulder. It made me realise how poorly I could potentially be with coronavirus. Not looking forward to the second dose, but rather have a reaction than the real thing.
Yeah.
Nikki nails it there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that idea that if you have a reaction, maybe that's because you would have had a really bad run, is a really an important way to think, actually. I like you, Nikki. And you're great. So our last general question, and we've had, I think, something similar in the thing for Vaccines General. Jennifer on Facebook, is the NHS currently measuring some immunocompromised and immunosuppressed people's antibodies for all 3 vaccines? So we can be assured that chances are that we are producing enough antibodies. How do we go about getting an antibody test for ourselves?
Yeah, so they're very good questions. So the first thing is, in terms of getting an antibody test, I don't think that is straightforward. My understanding is that in most regions, or in many regions, you can't get an antibody test for COVID. Now, in the hospitals, you can do an antibody test for COVID. We tend to do them if we think somebody is likely to have had COVID fairly recently, but we can't pick it up on the PCR swab test. So it can be useful, particularly in inpatients, if they're repeatedly testing negative for COVID on the swabs, but actually we think they do have COVID. It can be useful to see whether actually they've got evidence of prior infection. And I have done it in a few people who've come to me and said, look, I really think I had COVID, but I don't know. And when I've been doing blood tests for other things, I have done a COVID antibody test. So, you know, it is available in certain circumstances. Now, that COVID antibody test will measure your natural immunity to COVID, because that's what we're looking for when we're asking that question, have you had COVID? There's going to be a different antibody test coming on stream. And my understanding is that different sectors and different hospitals are doing different antibody tests. So the new antibody test will actually look at your immune response to the spike protein, and it will reflect your antibody response to the vaccine. It's not the same. So there are 2 different tests. There's one that tests your natural immunity to COVID, and there's one that tests your induced immunity in response to the vaccine and looks specifically at immunity to the spike protein. So that's the first thing to say on that. So I don't think it's going to be straightforward just to go and get an antibody test. The better news is that last week there was information about a study called OCTAVE, that's OCTAVE, and that is being run to look specifically at the question of antibody response and immunity to vaccination for COVID in groups of people who are immunosuppressed. Because, of course, there are a lot of people around with autoimmune conditions. So it's not just sarcoid, but people with rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, multiple sclerosis, inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's disease, some people with rare genetic conditions, chronic kidney disease, liver disease, those with cancer, people who've received either solid organ or bone marrow transplants. So there are quite big cohorts of populations around the country who are also, many of them either taking immunosuppressant medication, as in steroids, azathioprine, methotrexate, mycophenolate, and so on, or who have reduced immunity. And the OCTAVE study is being run in a number of centres, and it will be looking at immune response in those groups. So I think that is a very positive development and will help us work out what immunity people with autoimmune conditions and people who are on immunosuppressant medication do have. At the moment, I think it's going to be difficult as an individual to go and get an antibody test for the reasons I've outlined.
Can sarcoidosis people volunteer themselves to the OCTAVE study?
Well, that's a good question. I've actually just, when I read about it, I've emailed our principal investigator at Imperial to ask that very question.
Fantastic.
I will let you know when I find out.
Oh,
I suspect it hasn't been designed with sarcoidosis patients in mind, but I think it would be a good group to study if the protocol can be adapted.
Okay, so there, either there's a potential for Octave to include sarcoidosis, and if not, it might act as the precursor for then a study for sarcoidosis cohort.
Yeah, but it would give us a lot of information, which I think one could extrapolate to sarcoidosis, because they're similar conditions and people are often taking immunosuppressive medication.
Yeah, I think, and I think that's a very important point. But you can hear, like, so look, Robina, you can hear everyone watching with sarcoidosis. Robina has, very clearly got your back, and she is working very hard constantly. So, thank you for Robina. She didn't know that question was coming. Like you can tell, so that's her. I think actually that's really good. Thank you very much. Right, back to our. So we're now into vaccines and medication, and. Sarah via email said, can I take methotrexate injection today on the same day as the vaccine? The day after the vaccine, or should I wait a few days? The SarcoidosisUK website and the rheumatology depth of my hospital FAQs say continue as normal, but the vaccine centre staff told me to delay it a few days.
Yeah, so I mean the standard advice is to continue as usual. I think that's a very specific question, and as you will know, everybody reacts slightly differently to methotrexate in particular. So some people sail through their methotrexate once a week, and some people tell me they feel really rough for 48 hours after taking methotrexate, and everybody is different. So I think in that situation, I would certainly take the advice of the vaccination centre very carefully and very seriously, because they've actually looked at you as an individual and assessed your risk and your benefits as an individual, rather than just the generic advice that's out there. And I think if you're still concerned, then you should either talk to your GP or preferably your specialist, because somebody should be prescribing your methotrexate from a specialist centre and should be able to give you advice. And again, it will depend a little bit on your reaction, I suspect, to methotrexate and your experience with that medication.
Thank you. Michael asks, if the immune system is suppressed by steroids, how will it wake up and recognise the vaccine?
So this goes back to the question about how effective are the vaccines in those who are immunosuppressed. And that's why the Octave study is being run, to look at exactly that question. Now, we do know there was a paper published earlier this year that looked at the immune response in immunosuppressed patients to the flu vaccine in 2018, and showed that the immune response was significantly reduced in people who are on steroids or immunosuppressed with other agents. So it is likely that if you're immunosuppressed or you're taking steroids, your immune response to a vaccine will be less than if you weren't taking it. However, both the vaccines that are being used at the moment in this country, so the Pfizer and the Oxford vaccines, are really very effective. And I don't know whether any of you watched the December video that we did with Anna Blackman, who's a scientist who was working at Imperial College London, but has now gone off to set up her own lab in Canada. And she told us that when Pfizer originally designed their clinical trials and their vaccine development program last February, so February 2020 I'm talking about, their target, and this is an American company, so they were going for stretched, ambitious targets, was 70% efficacy. When they got 95%, they could barely believe it. It was so effective. And the Pfizer vaccine and the Oxford vaccine are way more effective, actually, than most people ever dared hope for. The average efficacy for the seasonal influenza vaccination is 50%. That gives you an idea of what we're working with normally. So given that we've got very effective vaccines, if you're on immunosuppressive medication, yes, they may be less effective than they would be, but they're still going to give you a measure of protection. And it's for exactly that reason that we still recommend that people who are on immunosuppressive medication have the seasonal flu vaccine every year. We know they may not get such a good response, but it's an awful lot better to have some protection than to have absolutely none.
And particularly, and that goes to our earlier point, right, that we talked about. If you have that lower level of immune response and you meet the disease in the wild, I mean, it's just you've got a double bad going on. You have less of a response, and you have less immune base and less of a response. So you have the disease then has much longer to replicate, and in doing so, much more likelihood to cause you harm. And so, getting some kind of base, and so yeah, ideally everyone would get a really high base, but in this world, that's not true. So, better to have some.
No, and the consolation to those of you who've had it and have had some side effects is that you've probably got good immunity as a result. Because the general consensus is that if you do get side effects, it's a sign that your immune response and reaction is kicking in nicely, give you good protection in the future. So that should be an encouragement.
Very good. And also, I did want to answer to that Michael's comment about that it needs to wake up your immune system. Actually, do you want to respond to that?
Well, it will wake up because it's going to be encountering something it's not met before. And just as I say, when you have your seasonal flu vaccine, your immune system will recognise it. It's going to be dampened. Yeah. If you play the piano normally and you use the dampening pedal to reduce the volume, yeah, it's a bit like it's going to dampen the effect, but it's not going to stop it completely.
Robina, that was such a cultured answer. I mean, it's very nice. And I'm going to go with a slightly less uncultured. Michael, your immune system is not asleep. It might be sleepy, but it's not asleep. All right, it's still there, but it might be sleepy. And a vaccine is like a quadruple shot of coffee. Like, yeah, if someone's used to a lot of coffee, then it's not going to wake them up as much. But everyone, 95% of people get woken up, from being slightly sleepy. Like it's an alerted. I fell in the metaphor. I said woken up, get alerted. They're not asleep, right? Oh, you're a cultured person, Robina, with your piano analogy.
No, that's one example. I suppose you could just talk about muting the Zoom volume.
There you go, and a modern person.
Zoom volume.
Eileen on the website. Is there any information that halting our immunosuppressants for several weeks either side will enable a better individual immunoresponse to the vaccine?
Yeah. There's no evidence for that, and I would caution against it for the same reason that I cautioned against stopping medication early on, actually, last year when we were having these initial sessions. And the reason is that if you're on immunosuppression and if somebody has made that decision with you that we think that your condition would be better if you were taking immunosuppression, you really risk a flare of your sarcoidosis if you then stop that immunosuppression. And you do not want to either encounter the virus or the vaccine, I think, if you can help it, with an uncontrolled flare of your sarcoidosis. So I think you want to meet those experiences with well-controlled, well-managed disease. So I would not suggest that you stop your medication. If you think that actually your specialist was talking about winding down your medication anyway, then you may want to have a conversation with your specialist because you may have missed an appointment or two, or they may have been rescheduled, and you may want to bring that forward and have that discussion. But my firm view is that you're going to be in a better position, really, whatever happens, if your sarcoidosis is well managed, well controlled, and you're on the optimum amount of treatment. And I wouldn't suggest or recommend stopping it.
Thank you. And that was there's such a good point about not wanting a flare up. It's like I was off camera, just going, oh yeah, that's a horrible potential. Nadia's asked a question. Which I have to, are there any contraindications with our immunosuppressants, blood pressure, steroid, and other medication? If so, how will they manifest, and what should we do?
I mean, I'm not aware of any contraindications. The main thing that you just need to be aware of is if you have a history of severe allergy, such as anaphylaxis, so wheezing, breathlessness, lip swelling immediately after medication, or the first shot of the vaccination, or anything else, any other substance, you should let the person who's going to give you the vaccine know about that before you receive it. That's really the only contraindication. So it's either a history of anaphylaxis, so if you carry an EpiPen, for instance, or if you experienced a severe allergic reaction to the first dose. But that would be hopefully on your records and they would know about it. It's all worth mentioning though.
Thank you. And I think certainly particularly worth mentioning when you get to the vaccine centre, because that makes sure that they know about that, and they may just ask you to wait for a while afterwards to check that everything's fine as they expect it to be. Barry just also chimed in to say, I've had my first Pfizer in January, my second's this Saturday. Only reaction was a sore arm with the first. We're into, there's a really important, we'll do it in side effects. Vaccine choice. So, sorry if this has already been asked. My GP has given me a choice of vaccine. I mean, Nikki on Facebook, you are a lucky. And actually, we haven't asked Robina. Robina, have you had your vaccine?
I have. I've had both doses. I'm very fortunate. I had my first dose 9:30 in the evening on the first day that our trust allowed us to have them. We were all invited. I was so keen. I went. It was very cold. It was just before Christmas, and I went at 9:30 at night to get it because I was so keen to have it.
That's fun.
And then I had my second one a couple of weeks ago. So I'm feeling very fortunate. But I certainly wasn't given a choice, and I don't know anybody who was given a choice.
No, neither do I. Nikki, you are lucky. Is there any evidence to show which is better for those of us with systemic sarcoidosis, please?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any data showing that either is better. And I think, they're both really good vaccines. They're both effective. The Pfizer data suggests it's possibly slightly more effective than the Oxford vaccine, but,
But then it's
the differences are small, and they may even out in the future. And we're getting more data the whole time. It may change, as I said before. Things are changing every week. So I wouldn't like to be quoted on that in the future.
Take either, flip a coin, just go. We're all jealous, Nikki. We're just. But brilliant, well done, lucky her. So we have a whole section of questions on vaccine efficacy, and I think we've talked. Addie's question was about will having an autoimmune condition reduce the efficacy, and I think we've answered that. They did ask just to understand why that is. It'd be nice just to hear. If you could tell people why it's slightly lower response. Why
you have a slightly lower response if you're taking immunosuppression medication, probably just because you are generally, and steroids are very they have lots of different actions, and most of the drugs that we use have different actions. They're not that specific, so they just, as I say, they just have this general sort of dampening effect on the immune system, and so they will tend to reduce an immune response to foreign protein.
Melanie asks a question that hits a nail on the head, and an unpleasant reality. Is there still a possibility that the vaccine will not prevent deaths if a person has other underlying conditions, but just reduce the chances?
So all the data show as I understand it, that's from the, up to last week, that both vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine and the Oxford vaccine, are around 80% effective in preventing serious disease and preventing hospital admissions, which is, really exceptionally good for a vaccine. So that means that you are very much less likely to get severe disease. You're very much less likely to get admitted to hospital or to need oxygen. You're much more likely, if you do catch it, to get a mild infection. Now, nothing is 100%, it never is. So you can't say that it will prevent all deaths, but it's clearly going to reduce them very, very significantly with that level of efficacy.
But that is and I think this though goes to the point of actually what the government's trying really hard, and the 48% of old people who've already broken the rules, you are part of this camp, right? Who go, right, like we can do whatever we want, go completely, particularly when there's a large group of people, me, who like haven't had the vaccine and actually go and cough, and it's not the right, that's not the right way to do that. Who therefore represent a reservoir of people who the disease can burn through. So if we, as a population, don't follow the rules, then we have a problem, and it will burn through. And then for those people for whom the lottery did not work, and they do not have the protection, just was fate bequeathed them, then they have a chance of dying, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen. And by reducing the ability for the disease to flow through our population, by us all having vaccinations, and so that the reason we wear a mask is to stop us giving it to other people. One of the reasons we have a vaccine is to stop us giving it to other people, and so this point is very important from Melanie, that no, this isn't a magic pill.
No. You're absolutely right, Henry. I mean, having a vaccination is always both about protecting yourself, but also protecting those around you. Yeah. It's a really important part of the equation.
No, thank you. And we've asked Eileen, who's asked a lot of good questions, has asked about the antibody test. I think you've talked very elegantly about that. And she has asked if there's going to be potential for a third jab. I think the answer is that you can hear there are tests ongoing. There are wider population antibody studies going on, and these questions are being thought about. Does it?
Absolutely. I suspect there may well be an annual seasonal vaccination.
Yeah. And we had another question on the difference between any difference between the reactions and effectiveness. Katie's asked, for each vaccine, and this is our last vaccine efficacy question, what is the difference in efficacy in taking the 2 doses within the different recommended time frame, e.g. 21 days and then 3 months?
Well, of course, we were one of the first, well, if not the first country to propose a delay in the second dose. And many of us were somewhat dismayed initially at this, but it does look as though it's a gamble that's paid off. And actually, with the Oxford vaccine, you seem to get better protection if you delay. And certainly with the Pfizer vaccine, it doesn't seem to be detrimental. So I think that strategy has paid off. I think it was a bit of a gamble.
I think Robina was sceptical. I
was sceptical. I think, and I talked to a pharmaceutical representative who was horrified because, of course, the idea that you would deviate from the protocol of a clinical trial is absolute anathema to them. And it's quite difficult for doctors as well, because when we prescribe, we have to prescribe according to the licensing indications and rules. And if we prescribe something off license, we have to make that very clear to people and say, look, this drug isn't licensed in this condition, but I believe it might help you. Are you happy to accept that prescription? And we have a go, we try it on that basis. And there are medications that we do that for, but it's the exception rather than the rule. Otherwise, the General Medical Council would have something to say about it. So I think it was always tricky. And some of us were rather cautious, but it certainly does seem to have paid off. And I don't think there's any doubt now that it seems to be fine to delay that second dose up to 12 weeks.
Thank you. We're being asked about side effects, and I want to go straight to one from Paula on Facebook, who's watching along and has asked this question. And it's an important one because I think it's been going around. There are rumours flying around that the vaccine could cause possible infertility problems in young people. Please could you reassure us that this is false?
Yeah. I mean, we talked quite a bit about this actually with Anna Blackman, our vaccine expert from Imperial College London, in December. And there really is no evidence for this at all. So, and she was very clear about that. And if you look at that, there's just nothing to bear that out.
And there's no, like, just on the sort of, which I think Anna would particularly have talked to, but in terms of the mechanism of how the vaccine's working, like,
No.
there isn't a route for it to do, like, it's such a...
No, there isn't.
For someone who has extensive medical knowledge, you just kind of look at that question and go,
No.
I mean...
No, and if you have, either of the vaccines, the messenger RNA is degraded within 48 hours or so of injection. That's the Pfizer vaccine. And the Oxford vaccine delivers the spike protein, part of the spike protein, through a modified harmless common cold virus. And those are, again, dealt with very quickly. So there is nothing permanent and there is nothing live. There's no live virus in the vaccine.
And like in terms of vaccinations, I mean, we have them as children, we have them as adults when we want to go travelling. There are certain countries where you have to have certain vaccinations to go to them. And honestly, I've been to a lot of those countries, and I've been a pincushion for the travel jabs, and I have two bouncy children. Like, it's just like it's like we're hitting antibodies all the time. It just isn't.
Yes, we are, and it's interesting that there is so much controversy around the idea of vaccination passports, because actually, as you say, countries have had requirements for vaccinations for a very long time. So if you travel to certain regions of sub-Saharan Africa, you need yellow fever vaccination. You need to be up to date with your polio. You may need a rabies vaccination. And if you're very old like me, you will remember in the early 1970s when there was an outbreak of smallpox, and everyone had to get a smallpox vaccination booster before they could travel. And this was just accepted. This was part of normal travel requirements. So it's sort of interesting that it's become such an issue with the COVID infections. When you think of the devastation that the infection causes, I think it's rather surprising that there is so much concern about requiring that vaccination travel.
Yeah, that's why I've been commenting on some people. Like, you got your second, and I know you're a big traveller, and I'm just expecting as soon as that date goes when people can fly, this country's emptying. But like all the people with like 2 jabs, they're just like whoosh, it's gone. And yeah, if I've got my jabs, I'll be one. I'll be
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a very important question that's being asked. It is one of those that's going around WhatsApp, and it's very important to put it to bed. So thank you, Robina, on that. All right, vaccines and side effects. I've been diagnosed as suffering. This is Michael on email, and I think you can see, by the way, that obviously we've been promoting this event for a little while, and people are getting in touch whichever way suits them best, so that they can. And everyone's very grateful to be able to put these questions to you. The fact that all these questions are here is a testament to how much people, how pleased they are to be able to get these answers. So thank you. I've been diagnosed as suffering COPD with sarcoidosis affecting the lungs and fatigue. I've recently received the vaccine AstraZeneca and suffered a relapse with the condition. And I'm sceptical about receiving the second follow-up vaccine in case I suffer another severe reaction. What's your what would you say to him?
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I think the first thing is I'd want to know what the relapse represents. You know, was it the COPD? Was it the sarcoidosis? What actually was it? Presumably you got some medical advice at the time, so you got a little bit more input into that. And I think, as I said before, where there are unusual or particularly tricky individual circumstances, I think you need to talk to your sarcoidosis specialist or your respiratory specialist if you have a respiratory specialist who's managing both conditions together, and get their input into that. Because obviously we can't give individual advice in these videos, but it's really important that somebody goes through it and tries to work out what did happen after that first dose. Why was it? Was it just bad luck? There are, of course, people I'm not suggesting this happened to you, but I have a number of colleagues who'd clearly contracted coronavirus a couple of days before they got their first vaccination. So they ended up ill, but they'd obviously caught COVID just before. So, these things can be coincidence or they can be causal, but I think you need to talk to your specialists about it and get more advice specific to your situation. Thank you.
That's a very important point about not being able to give individual advice. Like, people are too complicated for that. This is general advice, and everyone needs to know that disclaimer. It's a similar sort of question, but a bit wider. So Chrissy, through our website, said if our immune system is oversensitive and we've suffered a major flare-up after the flu jab, and I've been told not to have the flu jab again, can we have the vaccine if we've?
Yeah, well, it's a very similar question, isn't it? So I think whoever told you not to have the flu vaccine again must have had a reasonable reason for saying that to you. And obviously I don't know the situation, but I think, again, it's one where you do need to go and talk to your specialist and say, look, what would you recommend in this situation? Absolutely, because you don't want to put yourself at risk of getting the infection. You really don't. But obviously, if you've been told not to have the flu vaccine, that does raise some questions. I think it's quite reasonable to talk that through with your specialist.
And I think it is one for the specialist, I think, and it may be worth talking through that flu decision and understanding a bit more about it. But I would go to your specialist on that. So we've had quite a few people ask a similar question. So I'm going to, and I know we've touched on it briefly earlier. It says several people in the group have had antibody tests of some sort 3 to 4 weeks after the vaccine, but have had no antibodies. Could you explain how likely we can still have antibodies despite so? It's because actually Peter Ionata and a few others have asked similar questions, and they've been asking them just recently. So I just want to cover it again.
Well, I think it is, as I was saying earlier, and obviously I'm not an immunologist, but my understanding is that the antibody test that's been used widely until very recently has been an antibody test looking at natural immunity. And I'm actually part of something called the SIREN study, which is a study that's being carried out in NHS healthcare staff. And for that, we get a swab every fortnight and an antibody test once a month, a blood test once a month. And my natural antibody tests remain steadily negative, even though I've had 2 doses of the vaccine. And that's to be expected because that antibody test is measuring natural immunity and natural antibody production. Now, at some point, there may be a switch to measuring, if you like, not artificial immunity exactly, but the immunity that you've got in relation to the vaccination. There'll be a way of distinguishing between those 2 tests, and whoever's administered those tests will be able to tell you. But I don't think that test is in wide use at the moment. And it will need to be made quite clear when it's introduced that that's what's happening. Because otherwise people who are previously antibody negative will suddenly test antibody positive. And that's not saying that you've had the infection, but it is saying that you've had the vaccination.
Just say, like, for the dumber one of the 2 on this Zoom, like have I understood it correctly that the antibodies differ slightly, obviously, between if you've had it versus the vaccine? Do they then differ between the different variations of if you've got it in the wild, the different variations you might have been in contact with versus and then the same question to the different vaccines. So do you need a different antibody test for each variation potentially and each vaccine?
I'm not aware that you do. As far as I'm aware at the moment, there are only 2. One is testing your natural immunity and one is testing immunity in response to the vaccine.
Fair enough.
So those are the 2 I'm aware of. But I did say I'm not an immunologist.
You have, and it's very true. And I think as we go back to something you said at the very start, which is, we're continually learning about this disease and the different aspects of it, and that is potentially one of them. Paul has asked, do you anticipate the shielding advice to be extended beyond March the 31st? What's your money on? Because you're not worried, unless you're his alter ego, you're not Boris.
No, I would hope that it would not be extended. I've been struck. I'm naturally cautious, and I've been struck by the plummeting in infections and mortality figures last few days. They really are coming right down. And it seems to be that is reflecting the effect of the vaccination. So it's not just the lockdown, it's the vaccination as well, which is really encouraging. Now, it may go up a little bit, the R number may go up a little bit with schools going back. That's why the government is trying to allow a few weeks between each intervention, try and measure the effect of one intervention before it releases something else. I think that's sensible. But I would hope that the numbers could be down sufficiently that the shielding not have to be extended. So I haven't got a crystal ball. And I think, there are warnings, and it would make sense, actually, there are warnings that there may be another wave in the autumn, late summer, autumn of this year. And that's going to pick out, of course, people with no immunity. So it's going to pick out people who haven't been vaccinated. And I know that there is concern about that. And so it is possible, I guess, in that scenario, that we would see a reintroduction of shielding at that point. But I'd hope that with the coincidence of lower numbers, falling numbers, which are really encouraging at the moment, and warmer weather, and we know that coronaviruses are not a problem in the hot weather, and they're much less of a problem in the warmer weather, and most prevalent in the late autumn and winter months, that shielding would not need to be extended.
Yeah, I think it's very important now, the impact of the weather. I have to say, one of the things though that makes me a bit more, I am with you, the numbers changing is just so wonderful. And I think, and each one is a person, and those coming down, I mean, there are a lot of people who would otherwise be on that list not being there. It's so good, but it is still so awful. Like it's, that's why we mustn't count these chickens. There's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of people need to continue to play their part. I've got a question for you to enjoy. Okay, someone is channeling the Donald. I'm on methotrexate and hydrochloroquine. I've been reading about hydrochloroquine being a good drug to be on. Why are not more people on it?
Okay, so this would have been been a good question, wouldn't it, last year actually? So interestingly, so hydroxychloroquine kills COVID in vitro. By in vitro, I mean in the laboratory, in cell cultures. So it kills it. It's got antiviral activity. So it was put forward initially as a possible treatment, and the trial data showed that it wasn't effective. It was being used in quite high doses, I might add, much higher than we use in sarcoidosis, but it was shown not to be effective. It was also shown to have quite high levels of toxicity. That, of course, was largely because it was being used in very high doses. And then there was another study called the COP study, which I took part in, a number of people took part in, looking at whether hydroxychloroquine taken in much lower dose as a tablet daily, 12 weeks, could help to prevent COVID. So not treat COVID, but prevent infection. And that result was also negative. So there is no data showing that hydroxychloroquine prevents COVID. So sorry to disappoint on that. It is disappointing. We'd hoped it might be a treatment. It isn't. And we'd hoped it might be an effective prevention treatment, and it isn't. So despite everything that Donald Trump said and did about it, we have to take hydroxychloroquine off the list.
Yeah, so sorry about that. And yeah, talking things he said and did, he also took the vaccine without telling anyone, which I thought was pretty interesting. He's not our, like, you know, we're in a different country, people, so not our politicians. So we just look. I did want to say something to everyone. Like, listen to Robina. Robina is using studies and part of studies. They are very important. And if you want to, and a lot of questions have been about, what about sarcoidosis and X? And so, like, do sign up for studies. Like, and I can't underline that enough. And look, be like Robina. Like, she is in the SARN study. Like, she's first in the queue for the vaccine. Like I think these are important things. But like, join studies, and literally just Google NHS, sign up coronavirus studies. It takes you to the NHS page from which you can learn everything. You sign up. So do just sign up. They then qualify you. So if sarcoidosis is a problem for a certain study, you won't be brought on. So that stage happens. So signing up doesn't obligate you, and it doesn't mean you're on. It just means you're available. And we want sarcoidosis people to be available in those tests. So do sign up. I mean, I think that's a big deal. You can hear Robina quoting the studies. So this is important stuff. We've got 3 more questions left. So if that's all right, Robina. Thank you.
Of course.
We have one from a 13-year-old. I've had sarcoidosis for a long time, which I think is very unusual. Like, and like, you're the first 13. Anyway, I've had sarcoidosis for a long time. I'm taking immunosuppressant medication. Do you think it is safe for me to go to school?
Gosh.
Yeah, big one actually. That's
a very tricky one, isn't it? And as you say, I'm sorry to hear that, because sarcoidosis is very, very uncommon in children. I think you're going to have a really good conversation, maybe a video chat with your specialist, and talk to them about it. Because you really don't want to miss out on your education. You really don't want to miss out on your friendships, seeing your friends, all those interactions, really getting the help from your teachers that you need with all those subjects. And it's really important that you don't miss out on your education. But you will be at more risk. So have a chat with your specialist. I know that vaccination is not being offered to children as a general rule, but it might be that your specialist thinks actually there's a reason to put you forward as a special case. I don't know. This just come back to not being able to give individual advice. I certainly think it's worth a conversation. Don't just say, I'm not going to go to school because, without talking to somebody about that decision, because I think it's so important that you don't miss out on your education. It's not just the learning bits, it's the fun bits that are really important for you and for your future. But yeah, absolutely, you need a bit of help with this one, I think.
Yeah, it's a tough one, and they are, but now there are now studies going on at the moment for vaccinating children.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there'll be all sorts of other studies coming on. I suspect there will be comparisons of vaccines head to head and all sorts of things that will take place over the next few months.
Right, our last two questions. Jonathan, on the website, it looks like we may end up having a COVID vaccine each year. Those with sarcoidosis seem to often get other autoimmune diseases. Probably what that deserves a response. And the immune system does not work as expected. Is there a risk of repeated exposure to either the virus and/or vaccines that could cause problems to those predisposed to autoimmune problems?
Yeah, I don't see any evidence for that, and I don't see any reason to think that, because that's not our experience, for instance, from the annual flu vaccine. So if I'm honest, we don't have the data, but I would also say I wouldn't see any particular reason why that would be the case. Because the reaction that the vaccine is stimulating is a very specific one, just to those few bits of the spike protein that's in COVID-19. And all it's doing is just training your immune system to deal with that particular infection, that particular foreign invader, if you like. And I don't see, we do this every year with the flu vaccine. And I'm not aware that that is causing a problem. Thank you.
And back to an earlier point, we're doing a good job of coming back to those. Like, your immune system, you've got the flu vaccine happening every year, but you've also got you getting a cold every year, and you getting X, Y, and Z and interacting with it, and the different kinds of colds and the different things your body's hitting. So your body is hitting immune things all the time. This isn't the fact that there's one that you're going for an injection in isn't so different. It's part of what your natural body processes. We're on to our last question from Claudia. Would you recommend the vaccine for a patient with non-active sarcoidosis? And I think this is an important question because there's a big group of people, and this group, many of them will not yet have been offered the vaccine, so are starting to think about or about to get offered it. Would you recommend the vaccine for a patient with non-active sarcoidosis in remission for almost 10 years? And what are the risks of an abnormal immune reaction to the vaccine? And could it potentially reactivate the disease?
So it's an interesting question, Claudia. So again, I don't see any evidence that the COVID vaccination is going to cause a reactivation of sarcoidosis. We don't see it with other vaccines. And so I see no reason why the COVID vaccine would do it. The JCVI, as you know, has prioritised vaccination for people largely in terms of age. So obviously serious conditions and clinically extremely vulnerable people have basically been prioritised to join the older age groups. But after that, it's been done by age. And so people with inactive, quiescent, recovered sarcoidosis who are younger will only be being approached in the next few weeks and months. And yeah, absolutely, I'd recommend it, because if you don't have it, you will have no protection whatsoever. And if we get a third wave in the autumn, or you want to travel overseas, you're going to be totally vulnerable to this infection. And even if you don't get quite as much efficacy, immune reaction as you'd like, you're going to get some protection. So from that point of view, absolutely. And, you know, we have no evidence that it will cause a reactivation of sarcoidosis, and it has been given to a lot of people now. We know it's not only effective, but safe. So I would encourage you to have it.
And it goes back to that same question, that same point. You either risk getting it in the wild, which will almost certainly, we expect a much more dramatic effect, versus having it as a controlled, in a controlled way in a vaccine. And like, it may not be a choice that, you know, any of us wish we were in, but it is the choice we've got. And then when you look at it that way, I think the answer is very obvious. And you want to go at 9:30 p.m. and rush as soon as get your slot like Robina did. That is all our questions. I'm going to thank Robina in a second, but before I'm going to do that, I'm going to tell you when you're going to see Robina next, because she's fantastic. And so we have, and actually I think this is our first time announcing this, so we are excited to announce that that Sarcoidosis UK and the Royal Brompton have Sarcoidosis Patient Day. It's on the 1st of April from 10 to 4, and it's a free virtual event created specifically for sarcoidosis patients. And you'll hear patient-centered talks from amazing, knowledgeable, extraordinary professionals such as Robina. And Robina is clearly one of the stars of the day. And she's going to be talking on COVID-19 and sarcoidosis, risk and change management and monitoring. So for anything that you'll still want to be covered, you know, that's going to be the moment. But it is much more of it is a presentation. If you want to know a bit about signing that up, you need to join the newsletter and just go to the Sarcoidosis UK website and sign up for the newsletter there to see Robina again. But it is going to be much more structured, so it'll be her speaking on it, and then I believe we'll be taking some questions that would have been emailed in earlier, but to sort of help guide, answer anything that's come up and help guide that conversation. Robina, like, it is an absolute pleasure as ever, and I have learnt an enormous amount. You've heard all the questions coming in. You know that a lot of people have been watching and listening. I know it's a lot of time out of your day, and I know it's your day off. So I was really very grateful for it. But it's hugely meaningful. As you know, these get seen by thousands of people and are very, very impactful. But what you're doing, the work you're doing is very important. Thank you very, very, very much.
Well, thank you, Henry, as ever, for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure. And thank you to everyone who's sent in questions, because they're all very good and thoughtful questions, and they're important. And I hope it's been helpful.
Thank you. And the fact that people are asking those questions, there's almost certainly lots of people who want that same answer. So sending them in is important. There's a lot of quiet people who actually wanted to, will have wanted to send that in, but didn't quite. So they're always important. Thank you, Robina. It's been amazing. Thank you very, very much indeed. And I wish you a great rest of your day off. It's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for watching. It's for us to sign out now. Thank you very, very much indeed. And goodbye, everyone. And thank you again.